Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, whether you're joining us from across the world or somewhere in the country. It truly means a lot to gather here, across time zones, languages, for a conversation rooted in one of the oldest yet most enduring questions. What does it mean to live justly and piously? Tonight's conversation centers on Plato's Republic, but more importantly, on the questions it leaves us with. Questions about the soul, the city, and the shape of a good life. We are very lucky to be joined by thoughtful scholars and readers from different traditions, and it is my hope that you will find the conversation both challenging and generous. I am honored to welcome our speaker, Professor Alex Priou, a scholar of ancient political philosophy, a professor at UATX, and a co-founder of the New Thinkery podcast. His work helps bridge the careful attention of the classical world with the challenges of modern life. We are also joined by several special guests whose presence enriches this evening. Professor Kai Markel from National Cheng Chi University, whose work has opened dialogues between the classical Western philosophy and Confucian thought, and who have been incredibly generous with their insights. Kai Shuo, a PhD candidate at Boston College, who is also a dedicated reader and a scholar of philosophy. I am especially grateful for his support throughout this process. And last but definitely not least, Edison Tsai, the founder of 知道人文 and No Sense. I am personally thankful for his mentorship and his presence tonight. 我也知道今晚有一些中文观众加入我们，非常欢迎你们的到来。今晚的主题虽然源自于柏拉图，但我希望这次对话能够跨越文化与语言的界限，让每个人都能从中获得一些思考的火花。如果您需要字幕协助，请点击 Zoom 下方的字幕按钮，开启实时翻译字幕功能。在讲座过程中，您可以在 Q&A 区域提出自己的问题，也可以给您感兴趣的问题点赞投票。我们将在讨论环节中优先回答点赞数较高的问题，也希望尽可能回答大家的思考与关切。如果大家之后想重温今天的讲座，回放视频会放到我的 YouTube 频道 PPT 每一页都含有链接。Feel free to submit any questions you have during the talk. You can also upvote questions submitted by others. This helps us see which topics are most pressing or interesting to you. If you would like to re-watch the webinar later, the recording will be posted on my YouTube channel. You can find the link on each slide of this presentation. Again, thank you all for being here. After Professor Priou's lecture, we will open up the floor to a discussion amongst our panelists and answer some of your questions in the Q&A section. Let's begin.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie, for that introduction and for the invitation to come speak to you, and to everybody who's attending. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you this evening, or I guess it would be this morning for most of you. But for me, it's late in the evening, which is fitting because the Republic is a dialogue that takes place overnight into the morning. I should say something about the title, Plato's Piety, which you could actually, maybe we could say it's piety in Plato's Republic, because piety doesn't really have a strong place in Plato's Republic. In fact, it didn't seem to have much of a strong place in Athens during the life of Socrates, during the time that the Republic is dramatized as having taken place. To give you just a sort of bit of historical background of what's going on at Athens at the time, maybe a generation or so prior, the Persians had invaded Greece, coming over from Asia Minor, over the top of the Aegean, down through a region called Boeotia, confronting Athens. And Athens decided at that moment to abandon the city and fight on the isthmus, narrow bit of land that separates Attica, the region where Athens is, from the Peloponnesus, the large sort of bottom part of Greece. To fight there, and also in around in the narrow bit of water surrounding between mainland Greece and the island of Salamis. This is the Battle of Salamis. And what the Persians did is they destroyed Athens. The Athenians then eventually defeated them, but the city had been destroyed, including the Parthenon, which is a pretty shocking thing, right? For an ancient city to abandon your patron goddess and her home is a great impiety. And you would think you would be punished, but far from being punished, the Athenians were rewarded, at least in the short term. They survived. They survived, and they were immediately took to rebuilding or building up the walls. Only later did they build the Parthenon. I think that's a revealing historical fact. And so you move a generation or so later, and the Peloponnesian War is getting started. Athens inherited an empire over Greece, specifically around through the islands and where the Persians retreated up again over the top of the Aegean. And as the Spartans got really worried, they started attacking Athens, and Pericles, who was leading Athens at the time, just said, "Let them destroy our fields, let them destroy our houses. We'll live off of our empire. We'll bring everything in through the port." Um, that's a kind of strict or reinforced policy of what had happened under the Battle of Salamis, a willingness to sacrifice your ancestral homes and to live in this expanded sort of imperial set. So all of this is happening in the lead up to and then in the background of what's going on in Plato's Republic. What really becomes common in Athens at the time is something like a self-serving reason, right? Just cutthroat partisanship, that kind of thing. And the idea that one would respect ancient gods is really laughable among the intellectual elite of the city at the time. In fact, far from being traditional, things are actually quite innovative. And so, if we move to the first slide, this is really underscored at the beginning of the dialogue in its setting, the Festival of Bendis. And I've given you just the first few lines from the dialogue, where you find that they're going to pray to a goddess, but it's the first time they're holding this festival to this goddess. We find out it's a new goddess who's just being introduced for the first time, and they pray and they look on and then off they go back. So if there's anything that's going on religious, it's kind of innovative, right? It's inventive. Um, this is not a city that's going to be really stuck in its ancient sort of ancestral ways. So the first note we get about piety in Plato's Republic is that it doesn't play as big of a role as you would expect. This is confirmed actually with the first main character that Socrates talks with, which is, if we go to the next slide, uh, um, a man named Cephalus. The dialogue takes place at his house, though he's not present for more than a couple of pages. And he is a pious old man, and he's not the kind of man you tend to find in Athens. And part of the reason you do find him at all is because he's not actually Athenian. He's called a metic or a foreign resident, right? And he seems to embody kind of the pious worldview. Socrates cross-examines him and he quickly leaves, right? And that seems to signal, and many readers have taken it this way, that piety is gone. This dialogue is not concerned with piety. I think that's largely true about the spirit, maybe, of the inquiry. But one of the things I want to argue is that it's really about what human thinking looks like when you don't give piety its place. It's one way to read the Republic, and I think this really comes out if you. I'm going to try to bring this out as we read the dialogue. Is that piety plays a subdued, but very real role in the dialogue, and in fact, it seems to somehow kind of encapsulate the dialogue. So Cephalus is a pious old man. He's not an Athenian. In fact, he seems to be unlike all of his friends. They're concerned about death because they're going to miss out on any more partying. Um, Cephalus, it seems like, is concerned about death, not about what he's leaving behind, but about where he's going. And he's worried because he's heard all these stories, as we see in this quote. He's heard all these stories about what's happens to people in Hades who have done bad things. And when he was a young man, he says he laughed at them. But as he gets older, he gets a little bit more frightened. In fact, he's full of suspicion and terror, as he says it. Now, why is that? Now, he's not sure. He says, maybe I'm just frail and weak and scared, right? Or maybe I'm getting closer to death, so I'm seeing it for real now. I laughed because I was young and away from it, but now I'm somehow more aware that there's something going on after death. Um, in any event, as a result of this process, or this perception of some ills that he's done. He tries to make atone for his past transgressions. So he'll wake up in his sleep in a fright, as children do, he says, and he lives in anticipation of evil. But if he does his sacrifices, if he does his pious acts, he'll sleep well. That's in a way what piety offers us, by the way, and I think it's important to keep this in mind. Uh, if you've done right in your heart of hearts, if your conscience is at ease, you'll be at peace with yourself, right? You'll be able to sleep at night. Uh, One of the things I want to sort of bring out in as I speak today is whether the Republic seems to be trying to give a philosophic defense of justice, is trying to do what religion used to do, but no longer does in Athens. Can philosophy actually do this, or isn't philosophy always essentially questionable? Um, Another way to put that is, does anybody who's really thought about a question, how complicated it is, actually sleep well at night as a result? Maybe, maybe not. But it's worth taking seriously that question or that human need. When we talk about wanting to know what justice is, what we want is to have moral confidence, right? To feel good about it and to finally be able to rest our head and feel like we've done right. Let's go to the next slide. This feature of the dialogue comes out over the next three slides. So the bulk of the Republic is a discussion uh, between Socrates on the one hand and two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, and they kind of bounce back and forth. They interrupt and each other or they're kind of invited into the argument at different points. And if you really want to understand the Republic, you need to understand why this character or that character is speaking with Socrates. Um, as regards um, uh, the two brothers and what they bring to the table, it's worth to note that in the second book, they kind of present a new challenge. After Cephalus, Socrates speaks with his son, Polemarchus, who's a kind of decent young man. And then he speaks with a guy named Thrasymachus, who's very cynical, and he represents everything that's wrong in Athens at the time. Socrates defeats him handily, right? He really tears him apart. And Thrasymachus, I would think, realizes he was pretty foolish to try to contest with Socrates. But in this quote, what we see is that Glaucon wants to see that justice is good for its own sake. I don't want to hear about its wages and consequences. Oh, the just man is honored by others. Oh, the just man, people are willing to go into contracts with them, and they can marry people readily because they are good and upstanding citizens. This is praising justice only as regards its consequence, not in itself. Right? When you look at it itself, most people would say it's a pain. It's toil, right? It's drudgery. Um, and this is what Glaucon complains. He says, that's what everybody says. I've been talked deaf by Thrasymachus and countless others, but nobody has defended justice. And I think you're the guy to do it, Socrates. So this is obviously a statement about, who he's associating with, but I think it's also just a statement about what's actually going on in Athens at the time. Countless others. The phrase in Greek means myriads, but it almost means like everybody, right? Everybody you run into, and that's effectively what it means here. He wants Socrates to somehow drown out all this talk, so that his love of justice isn't deafened, right? That voice isn't completely lost amid everything. Um, he's asking Socrates to come in and provide the support that's no longer there. Adeimantus, if we go to the next slide, he offers a much more direct statement on the gods in particular. Excuse me. And he offers in this phrase a statement This is in the voice of another. This is a kind of, he makes up a couple little dialogues. And the dialogues are between a kind of decent young man trying to persuade a somewhat indecent or morally lapsed young man about trying to persuade him to come back to justice, but he's not very good at it. And when you start picking away at it, you start to realize this is kind of his summary of his own arguments with his brother Glaucon. So he's very worried about his brother Glaucon. But he presents this morally lapsed young man as arguing the following. And here I will read the text. If there are no gods, or if they have no care for human things, why should we care at all about getting away? And if there are gods, and they care, we know of them or have heard of them from nowhere else than the laws and the poets who have given genealogies. And these are the very sources of our being told that they are such as to be persuaded and perverted by sacrifices, soothing vows, and votive offerings. Either both things must be believed or neither. That is, either you believe that the gods care, but and they can be bribed, or you don't believe either. That is, there are no gods, or if they do exist, they don't care about us. So, if they are to be believed, the poets and laws, injustice must be done and sacrifice offered from the unjust acquisitions. So here he's saying justice is a kind of bribery. It's all consequences again. So, in a way, you could say Socrates is being asked to defend justice and to do for justice what religion used to do. But I think Adeimantus's quote shows that it's actually a little bit worse than that. He wants philosophy to do what even religion cannot do, right? Which is to convince people that justice is sweet on its own. Now, in Glaucon's speech, he talks about somebody essentially being martyred, right? And so Adeimantus is saying, prove that that's actually sweet and enjoyable, right? That having your eyes gouged out and being crucified is good for its own sake. So there's a huge, huge burden here. No poet has ever tried this, and even a god can't convince you of something like that, right? It's too much in your very flesh for you to deny that. And so Socrates reacts as he does on the next slide. He says he doesn't know what to do. He explicitly says, "I can't help out. I'm not capable of it." Right? But on the other hand, he says, "I can't not help out. Like I have to do something." Right? The best, he says, is what I did with Thrasymachus. The best is he can make Thrasymachus, who's a kind of cynic, look like a fool, right? Like he hasn't really thought about it this much. It's not a earned cynicism, right? He hasn't actually thought it through sufficiently to justify his cynicism. But again, he can't not help it. He has to do something because he thinks it would be impious for him to be here when justice is being spoken badly of and not to bring his help so long as he is alive. So this is a pretty strong statement. And this is early enough in book two, and there's 10 books of the Republic. There's another, I don't know, 260 pages left to go at this point. It's very easy, and there's lots of really captivating ideas. So it's very easy to forget about this moment. But we should never forget about it because from the very beginning to the very end, we have a new god on the first page, and we have a myth of the afterlife on the last page, bookending this work is reference to gods and to piety. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, Socrates, not much later, towards the end of book two, introduces a new theology. He says we have to supervise the makers of tales. So he's an advocate for state censorship, strict regulation of culture, right? Strict regulation of all literature and things like that. For the sake of moral formation, because when somebody's young, especially, but even when they're adults, if you're exposing them to bad models, you're going to make them worse. So you could say Socrates makes a rather elegant point, which is that uh, if you have a good moral education, if you can actually produce good citizens, freedom looks like freedom to be bad, right? So freedom would therefore be bad, right? So it's an argument really against anything like a kind of radical liberal democracy or something like that. Now, the way he says we should supervise the makers of tales as regards the gods, he talks about heroes and he talks a little bit about human beings, but he ends up setting that aside. If he talks about gods and heroes, we'll focus on gods. He sets down two models or two dies or two castes, which he calls laws. That is, these are what the sort of gods the poets need to speak about. They cannot depart from these models. And the two are as follows. The God is good and the cause of the good. And the second is they never transform themselves or lie, right? So what he's doing is creating a pure theology that existed in Greece. If we don't want morally compromised citizens, if we want citizens strictly devoted to the laws and to piety, they're going to have to follow these models in all purity, right? Um, this kind of echo of piety comes up again much later in Book 4. After building out the moral education in Books 2 and 3, he then ends Book 3 with a discussion of the noble lie. Book 4 has a kind of a digression on whether the sort of military class in this city are going to be actually happy, and Socrates defends that. And then finally go to find where justice is. And so, what is justice? The idea is that justice involves setting your soul in order, making sure each of the parts of your soul does what it's supposed to do and listens to the parts that it ought to listen to. And it creates a kind of internal harmony. And the idea is that if each part of the soul does what it's supposed to do, it's going to achieve the virtue distinctive of it, right? But it's ultimately it means monitoring what's within. I actually think this is not a bad way to think about justice. Go back to Cephalus, right? What is Cephalus? No, you don't have to go back to the slide. I'm just saying, think about it. If you go back to Cephalus, what is he doing? He's looking within himself to see if he's done anything unjust. He's trying to understand what it is he sees within him and maybe what he sees beyond. Or think about Glaucon. He's been talked deaf. He senses there's a voice within him that needs to speak, but he can't hear it. And every time Socrates asks him, "What do you think justice is?" Can you effectively ask him, "Can you hear this voice yet?" Glaucon says, "I can't." Not in so many words, but he just says, "You tell me what justice is." Things like that. And I think this is a really important lesson that justice isn't just following the laws. Justice isn't just focusing on what other people are doing and adjudicating things. That's obviously part of justice as we understand it communally. But what it means to be a just individual and what it means to be just in your soul does require looking within and asking yourself, what do you desire? How do you manage your desires? How do you educate your desires? Where do you tend in your behavior? And how do you take care of that? How do you manage that? Right? This is a kind of formula of moral self-restraint. It doesn't seem to me that this is the happiest understanding of justice if you're constantly regulating your desires that are off. But this might just be true of what a just soul actually looks like, that it is one filled with tension, right? But that there is a kind of satisfaction to be had with a sort of internal harmony. And we could even connect this back to what we were talking about with Cephalus earlier, with his sleeping well at night. I do think if you do this sort of thing, it does make you rest a little better. And a little later in the dialogue, or much later, I should say, Socrates proposes a little pre-sleep ritual to Adeimantus of how he could conduct himself. This is early in Book 9. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. We're going to jump way ahead now to Book 7. Um, and here he presents philosophy as a kind of savior, the philosopher kings as saviors. I've replaced kings with saviors in the title here because I wanted to have a tone of the salvation, or to show that Philosophy is salvific in this way, right? It's offering a kind of redemption or a kind of path back to moral health. Um, and there's subtle tones of this, but in this one passage, I just want to draw this to your attention. When he's talking about leaving the cave and going up to the heights of wisdom, he compares it to going up to Olympus from Hades. Um, that's a pretty powerful image. Um, and it suggests that what you want is the philosopher to sort of replace the gods, right? To be a new hero, you could say, who communes with the gods on Olympus. Let's say this is the Apollo as the sun, but who communes with the gods in Olympics or somehow brings their wisdom down back into the cave of our social life. So again, even though we've left behind Hades apparently with Cephalus, here it is coming back in this kind of mythic religious language. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, Socrates goes on to lay out an education that these philosophers would have to engage in. Um, as he goes through it, it gets incredibly more difficult. There's five parts to it, and I really love his description of this education because it's some of the most tricky work that Socrates does. I think he's really trying to impress upon Glaucon how little he knows, and so he does a couple of sneaky moves here. But Socrates lays out five studies. And many of these, the first two are arithmetic and geometry. Um, Glaucon would have studied, and so he's kind of excited. But then it turns out he needs to be doing things like three-dimensional geometry, which has barely been begun, Glaucon notes, and certainly hasn't been completed. After that, they'll have to do astronomy, and we're not talking about measuring the actual stars, but something like an abstract astronomy. And this had not been discovered in his time, and it's something we can't even do. There's something called the three-body problem in physics, which is once you have three things moving, the calculations get really, really difficult, impossible, really. And if you then, because we have considerably more than three things in the world, in the universe, the calculations are really just beyond impossible. So we can't even complete this education. And Socrates says, yeah, if you want to do this part of the education, you're going to have to not only discover it, you got to get the whole city behind it. So this is like a public research project, right? So suddenly the obstacles are not just personal but political. From there, he lays out an abstract harmonics as well. And so these five he lays out, and Glaucon's like, yeah, that hasn't been discovered either, let alone completed. After laying this out and laying out the fifth, Glaucon says the following: "That's a very big job you speak of." And then he says the following: "You mean the prelude or what? Or don't you know that all of this is a prelude to the song itself, which must be learned?" No, by Zeus. So Glaucon's really struck by this. Wait, that's just the beginning? So he's just been hit with with a hell of a bad news here, right? And so Socrates then describes the way up from the cave to the sun. He talks about divine appearances in water and the shadows of the things that are. This beautiful statement of the ascent from the cave all the way up to the sun and this grasping of reality. And Glaucon reacts in one of the most interesting responses that I think people don't think about enough. He says, I accept this as so. It seems to me extremely hard to accept. However, but in another way, hard not to accept. So it's hard not to accept because it just seems true to him. The way it's hard for him to accept is just too difficult for him, right? So at this point, having been presented with philosophy of salvation and thinking maybe he could be the person to fulfill it, Glaucon has his hopes completely dashed. And so his hopes are no longer to reform Athens, as seems to be the case, and to make Athens great again or something like that. But his hopes will have to leave this world. And that's indeed where they start to go. So let's go to the next slide. Here we are in book 10. And Glaucon is thinking about injustice, and Socrates is pointing out some things when you do them, if they're bad for you, they end up being self-destructive. So you shouldn't eat too much fatty food, or you shouldn't drink too much, or do drugs, and because and you know this to be the case because you'll get the punishment from them, right? They'll come directly from. Injustice doesn't really do that. He says it makes you sleepless here, you see in this line. So this is recalling Cephalus, right? If you do unjust things, you're going to be racked with guilt. Glaucon's been convinced of that. And I think he's in a way correct here. But it also keeps you alive, right? So when comparing the just versus the unjust life, the just life is clearly preferable. Uh, 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 um, the just life is clearly preferable because you can sleep at night, right? Um, and then he goes on in the next little bit here to say that the gods will also never neglect such a man, right? The person who tries to be most like these pure gods that he's set up. But then it's fine when it turns out to life, fine. But let's talk about being alive. Injustice sometimes saves our lives, right? So in the next slide, we see not the just versus unjust life, but the just versus unjust death. Um, and he talks about the prizes, wage, and gifts that come to the just man while alive from gods and human beings. So this is picking up right on the heels of the earlier passage. Um, and then Socrates points out, well, they're nothing compared to what you get when what awaits them when they die, right, in the next world. And Socrates now goes on and he gives a speech about the afterlife. It's a mythical speech. It comes from a man named It's referred to commonly as the myth of right? Died and he was lying on a pyre. He apparently died, but his body didn't sort of decay at all. And he was put on a pyre to be burned, and then he came back to life. And having come back to life, he told what he saw in the other world. He said that when his soul departed, it made a journey in the company of many, and they came to a certain demonic place. And what did he see there? Socrates says they received for each of their wrongs tenfold suffering. They got if they, struck a man once, they would get struck 10 times and so on, right? And likewise for their rewards, they get 10 times the reward. So this multiplicity, right, of rewards and punishments might make you choose uh, um, a just death, right? So um, the unjust death turns out to be worse. The unjust life turns out to be worse because of the unjust death, right? The death you get at the end. Uh, Now, in the course of this myth, let's go to the last slide now. In the course of this myth, um, Socrates is talking about all this really high mystical stuff, demons and these worlds and all these the fates, spinning your fates, and it all sounds very large. It's very impressive and it's captivating. There's long discussions of the shape and organization of the worlds that have the thread that are being used by the fates to sort of in part to help weave the future. But in the course of all this, Socrates pauses and in this quote gives a statement on what he says is at the very bottom of this quote is the most important choice for a human being in life and death, right? This is the whole risk for a human being, he says. Um, so he's not just talking about the afterlife and the choices we might make in the afterlife, which is one of the things the myth goes into. But he's talking about the choices we make in life as well. And he gives here, I think, one of the most powerful and direct statements to be found of philosophy in the whole dialogue. He says, each of us must I think in all of Plato. Each of us must, to the neglect of other studies, above all see to it that he is a seeker and student of that study, by which he might be able to learn and find out who will give him the capacity and the knowledge to distinguish the good and the bad life, and so everywhere and always choose the better from among those that are possible. It's a very complicated statement, but what he's trying to say is this: you want to live a good life, but the good life has to be possible, right? And to you then have to, for that to live that good life, you also have to choose the better from among those who are possible. And you have to do it everywhere and always. And for that, you need the knowledge. You need to be able to distinguish the good and the bad life. And you need to do so on the basis of knowledge and on the basis of some capacity, right? You have to be actually able to do it, right? Um, and that means somebody has to give it to you, he's saying. Somebody gives you this. But you have to find this person, find him out. Where is this person? And you have to learn who he is first before you go to find him out. And before that, you need to have to study to learn who this person is, what kind of person it is, right? And you have to do that. You have to seek what is the study that allows you to choose this person. And you have to do that before you study anything else. So in book 7, you get a long description of all these different studies that the philosopher kings have to do, and it's impossible. Here you get a different description. And it's very complicated. I've tried to work backwards to kind of show you how it's layered, but we can just say we're like 7 or 8 steps away from actually living a good life. And the steps are not easy steps. But they can be boiled down to the following question: who ought you to associate with? Right? What kind of a friend should I have? Who's going to actually make me better and help me live a better life? Now, he goes on to say, if you're going to do this, you need to think about um, your habits, your circumstances, etc. Think about all of them and combine them and think about different features of human nature. Like, what if you're strong? What if you're from good birth? What if you're from poor birth? What are the outcomes for people like this? What's possible for them? And what are the pitfalls, the obstacles for such people? He says you got to do all of this. And it's kind of like, obviously, I think just an inquiry into human nature and the human condition, right? The circumstances in which we find ourselves. It's a kind of investigation of the human realm. Um, in a way, this is where he's trying to bring Glaucon back to. And so to return to the question of piety here at the end in this afterlife myth, um, you can say one of the lessons Socrates has for Glaucon is he should take piety more seriously. He asked philosophy to defend justice, to do what piety or religion used to do. And he spins it out for him. He says, I have to do it. It would be impious of me not to. So I'm going to do this. I'll give you this. Here are your salvation. Here's your salvation, philosopher kings, right? It's exactly what you want, right? A kind of divine or prophetic philosophy, right? Turns out it's not for him. And it turns out that if he's going to live a just life and even endure a death in the name of justice, he needs to believe in the afterlife. But what Socrates puts there right in the heart of this afterlife myth is a very sober teaching about the need to investigate human nature. And you could say the thing that Glaucon does need to investigate, that he hasn't really adequately, is why he demanded so much of philosophy, more than it could have. Um, shouldn't he have taken, looked around him and seen what's going on in Athens and taken more seriously the ancient religions of his people, the ancestral religion? And so I think one way to think about where the Republic ends is it kind of urges you to go read the only dialogue Plato wrote that's longer than this, the Laws, which begins from the possibility that gods give us our laws, or the gods can be the source of the laws, that they could be divinely revealed. And yet it tries to see to what degree you can establish the good life within that sort of purview. So the Republic, you could say, looks like a very impious book. It looks like it's all about the rule of reason, right? But I think subtly it's making the case that you ought to take piety more seriously. Because if you don't, you might end up, like Glaucon, turning philosophy into a religion and expecting salvation from an activity that is really full of doubt, that can make you quite happy, right? And that can make you live perhaps the best life possible for you, given your constraints, etc. But it's not going to save you. And it's not going to offer you redemption, certainly not in the afterlife. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Priou. That was a really interesting lecture, and I'm really grateful for the clarity brought through such a topic. And I have actually a few questions that I thought about throughout the talk, and I noticed that in one of the pages, Socrates, he speaks of justice as something internalized to the private man. And I quote somewhere he says, not with respect to a man minding his external business, but with respect to what's within. And somewhere else he says he doesn't let each part in him mind other people's business or the three classes in the soul meddle with each other. And if I were to take this definition literally, it seems to me that justice, for at least Socrates, is something fundamentally inward. It's a kind of harmony of or ordering of the self. But is if justice is something we only practice internally, what bearing does it have on our outward lives? Or should the just man withdraw from meddling or choose to involve himself in, let's say, the public life or the political life? And if that is the case, how then should we make choices in order to live the good life?
Yeah, I mean, you could say, I mean, obviously, a just man needs to be concerned with other people on some
Yeah.
level. And justice does involve sort of relating to others. But I think there's a very sort of, maybe this is kind of mundane, the way I'm going to put this, but how can you hope to be just to others unless you've yourself put your house in order, right? You do have to sort of look within and try to sort out your soul, and then you can actually relate to others in the way that you ought. But I would even say there's something maybe a little less nice about this. You know,
Mm-hmm.
he's been asked to prove that justice will make you happy. And one of the shocking things you start to realize about the account of justice at the end of book four is he doesn't mention happiness once, just drops out. Uh, they're very enthusiastic, or Glaucon, I should say, is very enthusiastic about this definition. And this is a description of the just soul in moral self-restraint, right? So when you really start thinking about what does this look like, given the education he's outlined, it might involve saying, I can't believe you want this, you desire this. That's not yours to have. You're falling short of what you ought to be. Look, you've been educated on poetry and literature, religious texts, let's say. You're not as good a man as these heroes. You're trying to emulate them, but look at the ugliness inside yourself. So there's also something ugly about it. There's a different account of and this soul does look ugly much later. It's actually said to be ugly, and so this is less than midway through the book. So you have to be cautious about saying this is somehow uh, sort of the final word. It's obviously
Mm-hmm.
provisional, I think. But in book six at the beginning, Adeimantus, Socrates is discussing with Glaucon a kind of what the moral virtues look like in the philosopher's soul. And there, let's just take one example, the restraint of desire, right, or moderation. Moderation in the philosopher's soul is not done in this way of like trying to restrain your desires, like and fighting against them, right? Like growing angry at yourself is kind of how it looks in the Republic, using reason allied with your anger, your spiritedness to kind of keep your desires restrained. There, it's that a philosopher might understand that if he wants to spend all of his time thinking, he can't be stuffing his face until he can't stay awake or move anymore, right? He can't be so drunk that he can't think straight anymore, and so he'll abstain from excess in this way to a great degree and seem very moderate. But it's not out of moral self-restraint. It's because he wants to spend all of his time. He's totally immoderate in following his desire to think and to philosophize. So that's one way to think about how The moral virtues look differently in the just soul versus I would just say, the philosopher's happy soul in a way, right? There's a real difference between these two. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's the direction one has to think about it, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, and I do think there's lots of things to think about regarding that on that topic, and I obviously still have to do a lot more readings, and there's also there's this other thing, maybe probably not a direct follow up, but rather closely related. Is that Socrates places immense faith and very high expectations in education to lead the best part of the soul towards what is best. But what I've noticed with school, or let's say education to generalize now, is that it often emphasizes productivity and excellence and achievements over educating students on topics of virtues or, let's say, moral or civic purposes. And a lot of people, many may argue that philosophy is for the few and that the form of education is, at the end of the day, the choice of each individual. But I've always wondered, kind of, a question for you is that do you think there's still some room for the pursuit of truth as a defensible aim of education in a world that no longer sees truth or justice as a started or even attainable good for people?
Yeah, I mean it's one of the scholarly questions about the Republic is you get this artisan class, then you get this guardian class, and then we just kind of forget about the artisan class. Do they
Mm-hmm.
get the poetic education that's given there, or if they do, how do they react to it? They're obviously not going to emulate it. They're sort of maybe to revere these poetic types and interpret their guardians along these lines because they have everything to be afraid. You have a military camp basically in the middle of the city. It can very easily look like or descend into, if it isn't in fact, a relationship between masters and slaves, right? So that's a real worry. You could maybe get a little bit more in the direction of an everyman's education in Aristotle's Ethics, where at least you have the discussion of justice, and there's stuff like how to relate to your family, etc. But Aristotle also ends the Ethics by saying, for most people, they just need the laws, right? They need pure restraint and everything that comes with that, right? Like real punishment, etc. The Greeks were concerned more with the few, right? They were more concerned with moral excellence and virtue, and it's the few, but it could be quite a few people actually. It could be quite a few people if they're going to be committing their time to reading this, right? Aristotle's Ethics and Plato's Republic, books of philosophy on the nature of politics. This is not something that somebody with like um, habits is going to be able to sort of sit
Mm-hmm.
through. So I think when you look among young people who are not yet philosophic, and you look at like a kind of noble or aristocratic class, they might have the proper taste to start thinking about these questions. That can't be the whole story, obviously, but I think it's as a general statement of their strategy, it seems correct.
And I honestly, I think that's a great answer because I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it's just something that's really hard to answer because there's really is a lot of things that students are now faced with, and there's really not a lot of time for us to be as engaged as the Greeks are probably with texts that involve uh, moral purposes and stuff like that. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah,
let me say something. Let me say something on this that you know the you often get this criticism. I'm not saying you're being critical of this, but you often get this criticism of the Greeks as elitist. Um, but the people who say this, they always point to the high moral demands, right, and the condemnation of the people. They don't actually engage with the criticism of democracy and of rampant freedom and license and what it does to the soul. And my guess is that those passages, well, they don't really want to take it seriously, but also I think those passages are just like too uncanny and direct to statements, at least in the United States, When I read those passages on the regime decline about the nature of democracy, some of the descriptions sound just like my worst students, right? The most listless students who have nothing, no serious guiding purpose in their life. One thing a morally well-educated person, somebody who's been brought up with proper virtues of character, one thing they'll have is they'll have a clear sense of the importance of pursuing a clear goal, right? And
Hmm.
structuring your life around it. The best we do in our world, I think, I'll just speak again from my perspective in the States, that one thing we do very well is that if you want to succeed, and often even if you just want healthcare, you better be very good at something, right? And so
Mhm.
education requires quite a bit of discipline. Success requires quite a lot of discipline. And so, when I taught humanities to engineering students in my current position. I teach very ambitious students, and these students recognize that. They set up
Mhm.
their own goals and they structure their life around it. And so this develops some virtues. What virtues are they? Well, kind of discipline, a kind of um, seriousness in this way. Are they courageous? Maybe in a kind of narrower sense. Are they magnanimous and liberal? No. I mean, this is a very different. This is a very kind of lower set of virtues, but it is a kind of virtue, right? It's a way in which we encourage it. So, when people criticize it as elitist, I think that they're fundamentally being unserious.
Mhm.
Um, and the last thing we need to do is to continue down the path of not taking seriously the things that we um, uh, the virtues that really do sustain a society.
Great. And with this, I'd love to open the floor up to our panelists and see if there's anything they'd like to add or explore any further.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. It's great hearing your lecture on the Republic. It's a great and vital fundamental topic that we're treating here, piety, and I very appreciate your effort to bring out the element of piety in the Republic, which, as you rightfully said, tends to be overlooked by people, especially nowadays. The word piety, as we all know, is seldom used in the United States, except in some circles. For the typical youth, the word probably was rarely ever mentioned in their lives. And it's very important for us to be mindful of this element throughout Plato's works, including the Republic. And it's really great that we have now turned our attention to this uh fundamental topic. So would like you to just elaborate more on this particular point about Glaucon, because you mentioned that Glaucon somehow is of a sort as to be receptive to Socrates' peculiar claims and assertions throughout the plot of the Republic. You brought up the example that, the Glaucon said, yes, it seems hard to accept on one hand, but it seems not hard not it seems hard not to accept on the other hand. So he kind of wavers here, right, between two things, but it seems that he wants to believe the thing that Socrates offers. My question is, could you elaborate on why he is kind of receptive to these claims? What is it in him that makes him?
Yeah. No, this is a good question because, and thank you for your kind opening remarks. But this is a really important question. So when I used to teach the Republic initially, I would teach alongside Homer and Hesiod and other things, but mainly Homer, the Iliad, and I'd be trying to show how Plato was and Socrates were creating a kind of new hero surrounding the philosopher and new gods, right? And it was helpful. And some of my engineering students would be like, yeah, why does this matter? But then I started to realize I really need to be reading it with Thucydides, the historian of the period when the Republic is dramatized as taking place. And what I saw there is these young men, Glaucon and Adeimantus, but I think Glaucon especially, um, they're really in a morally compromised situation. So when Glaucon says, I've been talked deaf by Thrasymachus and countless others, That's a statement of his dissatisfaction with Athens, right? About everybody around him. But when he says he's been talked deaf, that means he can't hear anymore. He can't hear a voice. I like to think of it as the voice of his conscience, of his love of justice. Um, and so it's not just that he wants to escape Athens. It's also, I think, that he wants to escape himself, that he feels himself in a kind of fallen situation, right? And I think this is a situation a lot of people, young people, find themselves in, at least in the United States. They seem to be deeply torn between wishing that things weren't the way they are and being tempted by the idea of becoming corrupt oneself because at least it pays. I might as well get paid while I'm alive in this situation. Um, and so what Glaucon is finally given in the Philosopher of Kings when they're introduced at the end of book five is the one thing, Socrates says, that will fix everything, right? It's the one big thing you can do. It all turns on one man. Make a philosopher a king or a king a philosopher. Those are not the same things, by the way. He describes both, but we don't need to go into that. So it's kind of it's put into his corner, right? He's given a path, a path not just to saving Athens, and not just to saving himself actually, but all of Greece. It becomes pretty clear right in the lead up into the Philosopher Kings in Book Five. Um, a person who's in that state, and this is to get to really try to give you an answer to your question, a person in that state really does need salvation, right? They do want to get away from themselves.
Yes.
And when they can't fix Athens and they can't fix themselves in this world, by the time you get to it in book 10, and he gives another description of the soul as the statue of Glaucus, it's now deformed. The city has deformed the good parts of your soul. It's barely recognizable even as human. It's like a monstrosity with all this accretion of sea gunk on it, right? It's awful looking. That's a statement of fallenness. So the acceptance of philosophy, this desire for it, and then the religiosity, I think, is built into this. And one of the things I think is really important to get from the Republic is to accept the constraints of your circumstances. That last quote I read is about that. Like, okay, what are you? Like, what are you really? How smart are you? Like, how disciplined are you? How much money do you have? Right? How good looking are you? These are all things that affect your outcome in life. You have to take that frank assessment of yourself and accept that part, what you have, and see what you can change and try to live the best possible life you can and try to associate with those that can help you live a good life. Glaucon's not doing that. He cannot handle what he is and what Athens has made him. And so ultimately he has to go down this religious path. I just don't see how he's going to do otherwise. He doesn't have the ability to look within sufficiently such that he could begin to make real changes in his life.
And I have in mind his ready acceptance of the doctrine of ideas proposed midway in the dialogue. As we all know, Plato is known for this idea, the doctrine of ideas, and a lot of people have tried to make a system out of Plato's claims on this front. But here it is a famous place where where Socrates confronts Glaucon with this very rarefied doctrine of ideas, and doctrine just takes it. Glaucon doesn't seem to want to put severe objections to this very rarefied doctrine. So that's something already perplexing or remarkable.
It
Just give.
is. It is. And the place where Glaucon really gets turned with this, so he lays it out at the end of book five, this doctrine. And the way that he really gets convinced is in the beginning of book six, because at the beginning of book six, they make clear, okay, the philosophers have the intellectual virtues. That's basically what that argument is trying to sell him on. And it seems like there's one suggestion that maybe they've talked about this before. That's kind of brought up. Beginning of book six, he says, does this mean they also have the moral virtues? And he mounts this argument that the philosophers have, merely by virtue of being philosophers, all the moral virtues. And some pretty bad arguments in there. And Adeimantus is like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. But Glaucon is really hooked there because he realizes he can have the knowledge and the moral excellence at once. He really wants to be both. So you're right. It is a strange thing that he accepts it. But I think the acceptance is ultimately made on the basis of the moral payoff, right? The fact that he'll be deserving, that he'll not just have the knowledge of how to rule, but he'll also have exceptional moral virtues that'll earn him praise.
Yes, very serviceable, very convenient.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
And I think we have a few questions from the audience that I think are very insightful. One question from Xanatos, I quote, insofar as I'm concerned, Plato's Republic seemed to shift the focus from piety away from traditional religious practices and towards a more philosophical alignment with justice and good. Do you mind sharing with us how you understand Plato's conception of piety across his dialogues, especially in relation to tension between the civic religious piety of Euthyphro? Please correct me if I'm wrong on this, and the philosophical slash rational piety implied in the Republic, end quote.
Yeah, this is a massive question. You could even throw the laws in there. I think that that's only going to complicate things more, and maybe that's convenient for me because if I complicate things enough, I'm not I'm required to give an answer
Mhm.
anymore. But I'll just say, I tend to read the dialogues dramatically, and so I would think about Euthyphro in the context of where it's taking place in Socrates' biography, as Plato has laid it out, and this is around his trial and death. Euthyphro is a kind of interesting character. Euthyphro and Cephalus seem to be the closest thing to traditional piety that you find, but it's not traditional. Like Cephalus is a kind of pious old man, but he's also morally corrupted. He's been brought to Athens by Pericles as a arms dealer, right? And so he's already got a little bit of Athens on him. Euthyphro, too, he's a kind of religious innovator himself. In fact, he thinks of himself as kind of similar to Socrates. The funny thing about Euthyphro is that though he is very unorthodox in ways, he's also quite orthodox in that in a way that few people in Athens are, he actually believes what the poets say about the gods. He just has very wild interpretations of it. So it's the kind of thing where people will read the Old Testament and the New Testament, come up with some harebrained idea. They're a strange mixture of something unorthodox and orthodox. And one of the things I think Socrates is up to in the Euthyphro and cross-examining him is seeing whether, by showing him that he's not totally aware of the problems he's raising, that maybe he ought to be a bit more conservative in his views. So he's kind of walking him back to a more orthodox position. So I would tend to think of these dialogues as kind of strategic in what Socrates is trying to accomplish. But in both, you could say what Socrates is trying to show, and I think this is true of Cephalus as well. In both the dialogue with Cephalus and with Euthyphro, Socrates is concerned with the deep philosophic question, which is how does the poet's teaching about the gods, on the one hand, square with our kind of rationalist impulses, right? So to go back to Cephalus, he says, implies, I should say, justice is paying your debts and telling the truth. The problem is if your friend loans you a weapon and comes back to get it and they're raving insane, you ought to not give them their weapon back and you ought to lie about it. Say, oh, I lost it. Sorry, I'll have to get you a new one. Because that person could harm himself, could harm you, could harm somebody else, right? It would be bad for everybody involved. And so what that shows is that justice ought to be good for everybody involved. That's really what we expect of it, right? And so if any account of justice or any law doesn't really seem to benefit people, especially the people who are adhering to those laws, we tend to not think that it's actually just. Well, what happens when a God decides that something's just? Is a God beholden to these outcomes and to these scenarios. That's something at stake with Cephalus, something certainly at stake with Euthyphro, and it's something obviously of deep interest to Socrates as he's trying to base his life on these investigations of what the good life is and what are the ends we ought to pursue and in what way. Um, as he's trying to do all this, he has to be aware that there are some people who believe, maybe they're not that many in Athens, just these two oddball types, but there are some people who believe you ought to just obey the gods. And how do you square divine will with something like natural necessity, right, or a kind of indisputable sort of necessity? Um, is God second fiddle to, the forms or the ideas? I mean, that's a big question. That's very much on the surface of the Euthyphro, and I think also lurking in the background of Socrates' conversation with Cephalus.
Thank you so much, Professor Priou. And we have another question from one of our attendees. They actually raised three questions. I'm going to raise them to you one by one. The first one is that on what Socrates refers to as the song itself. If my memory is right, the song used here in Greek is nomos or law. What do you think this song itself or nomos is if the five subjects are only a prelude to it?
If, let me just look up. We can actually double check this. Uh,
Mhm.
oh, it's actually a footnote here. Uh, book 7. Two, I don't have to look up the Greek. Yeah, it is nomos there. It's interesting the way that the word law can also mean something like a flute song. I think is more specifically um, a lead in to it. The law. I mean, maybe I'll just complicate the question as a way of answering it. Um, if we have this reference to a song, it's also this word for law, but the song is also dialectic. You could say, what does it mean that dialectic or this sort of essential philosophic activity of examining your opinions and moving up and trying to ascend to the good in itself, or the good as beyond being, as it were, in this account we get in Book 7 of the Republic. What does it mean that that activity is referred to as a kind of law? As a song, maybe makes a little more sense. There's a kind of musical temptation, maybe, to thinking. You're kind of drawn this way and the other, sometimes in unpredictable ways. Um, but then you also want to think about it as compulsory as well. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have a firm worked out thought here. Uh, um, uh, Here, I'll just say dialectic is following as a song following on these five studies doesn't make sense to me, and I think it's hard to say that it makes sense because it's that account that he's giving of these sciences. I mean, you can start to put them together. It starts to look like something like a really powerful mathematical physics that will be able to understand everything that's going on in the sky, all the motion of everything, and how that'll affect mating, right? And floods and things like that, right? So it's something like a completed physics put together with like a human biology and the breeding program and everything. So it's something like that. What dialectic looks like after that, that to me is just it starts to look very strange. And Socrates, you know, at this moment when Glaucon actually asks for the song, he says, I can't do that. So we don't even get a glimpse of it, really.
Mhm. And their second question is, I quote, you said that Plato's Laws is the book that the Republic is leading to, but I wonder if Timaeus is a more intuitive transition from the Republic, for Timaeus begins with a recount of the best regime and then proceed to a nomos addition to these connections. Al-Farabi, in his philosophy of Plato, also posits Timaeus in between the Republic and the Laws. I wonder, how do you understand the role of Timaeus in Plato's philosophy?
This is interesting. This is a difficult question, and these are all very, very smart and insightful questions. I really struggle with the Timaeus. The account of the Republic given in the Timaeus is very limited. It's missing a ton of stuff. It makes you wonder whether Socrates kind of gave versions of this conversation here and there to different people. Is this an earlier version, or maybe it's a later version that didn't go as far? It seems like whatever version it was, it didn't go that far. It is the best regime set in motion, as this attendee noted. Um, and it is related, I think, to the first question, which is if we're talking about the relationship between physics and something like the best regime, right? You could say that the Republic gives a kind of structural account of this sort of thing, but then the Timaeus goes in. One thing I'll say about the best regime in motion, it's about the best regime in motion, but also in this kind of like coming out of the roots of like physics. Uh, and it's almost like coming out of its like origins in a way. Book five is very strange in the Republic. It actually really it starts from the question of families, women and children in common, which is really about perpetuation. So that's like Greek genesis in terms of becoming. Like, how does it stay the same even as it's becoming? But that question also then just changed into the question of Genesis is coming into being, and it turns into a question of founding. So it seems like there's an attempt in the Republic to put the best city, the best regime into motion as a city. Um, both of those discussions get cut short. Like the discussion of women and children gets cut short because Glaucon gets frustrated and wants to know how to make it come into being, right? He wants to know how to generate it. And the generation question gets cut short because by the end of book seven, he's given up on it, right? At the end of book seven, he says, well, you have to kick everybody out over the age of 10. And then I guess you get a couple philosophers to raise all these kids together. That doesn't seem very feasible. And so it does feel as though there's an attempt in the Republic along similar lines, but this is a larger difficulty of something I haven't figured out is how what exactly to do with the Timaeus. It seems to follow coming the day after, but it seems like a different dialogue. So I want to say I'd like the Timaeus to be somewhat more uh, disconnected from the Republic as we have it, and I want to.
Uh,
Um,
and to
we should
return to the
retain the
question,
right to move it around. Yeah.
uh, to return to the topic of piety, do you think Timaeus contributes to the question of piety in any way, in a significant manner?
It's difficult. I'm not gonna go into that. I haven't. I don't. Yeah, I mean
Okay.
that would be an obvious direction you want to take for sure.
And to return to the attendees' last question, it actually uh, echoes with what Kaisho wants to do, is to return to the topic of piety. And they ask, do you think that the life of the philosopher is unsustainable without a kind of piety towards gods? If so, what might be the difference between the god of Socrates and the god of Greek?
Well, they're certainly not equivalent. This is an incredibly difficult question. And right now I'm writing an essay on early Greek thought and Socrates. And I've just been trying to wrestle with and put into writing some of my thoughts on why Socrates died. And it's very hard to understand what he hoped for, but it is a hope for something after his death. And I struggle to understand how he could have a hope like that and give up possibly some very interesting conversations. If he had gone to Crete, the laws looks like what the kind of conversation Socrates would have had he fled to Crete. He had this opportunity. He might have had a really interesting conversation, but he didn't. I think that's what Plato's trying to show us on some level with the laws. Um, Is that a kind of piety sustained by a kind of God? Is that what informed Socrates' decision to die, or even Plato's decision to write such a powerful account of Socrates' death? That's above my pay grade, but it's a very important question. That's how I would begin thinking about it.
Um, uh, I think I also have another question that I was thinking about during our discussions is that in your lecture you talked about how the 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 just or unjust death is that there would be judgment that comes after death, and that um, uh, in believing philosophy as a religion, the restraint that comes with it does not equal saving that comes along. And I was just thinking that as we read the Republic, it doesn't mean that we have to live in the Greek world, and that where gods and piety is also a thing that's not as commonly talked about. And I think it's the same thing as nowadays is a lot of people no longer believes in the gods where fear judgment after death. And I think that horizon of piety is collapsed and into probably more of considering what comes in the present. And I was thinking if the words of justice in Plato's account are largely intangible and comes only after death, and um, in tenfolds after death, it would be hard to believe that many wouldn't choose the tangible and immediate gains over those of the just acts, like he's also stated in the Republic and many of his works. How then would a person be able to be persuaded to choose the just life through, let's say, education, practical incentives, social enforcements, and whatnot?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's all fair. I think, the modern world is built on the notion that you don't really need these things, right? If you actually just give people permission to be nasty and then rig the system so that it controls for nastiness, it's actually a lot easier. You don't have to worry about all this difficult business of education. You don't have to worry about and like moral formation in this way. You can just kind of build the kind of it's like shooting water through pipes or something like that, or it was like the example of driving a car. Like when you're driving a car and you're going, 80 miles an hour down the highway, you're not thinking about the millions of explosions happening right in front of your face in the engine, right? Because it's controlled, right? In a way, that's what kind of modern institutions are like. But it turns out those institutions get weaker and weaker, and the engine starts to fall apart from the explosions, um, the further you erode those things. So I think people feel like you need to go back to something before. That said, the philosophical life, as I understand it, on the basis of Plato, really dispels a lot of the hopes that come from religion. People really want to be happy. They want to live a good life, and they think living a good life will make you happy. Aristotle suggests in quite a few places, actually, that you could live the best possible life available to you. You might not be happy. It could be pretty bad, awful life. I always think of Jacob in the book of Genesis when Pharaoh asks him, "How's your life been?" He goes, "The days of my sojournings have been few and evil." And when you think about his life, he had a falling out with his brother. His son Joseph was apparently dead, and Judah also left home, and his family is starving in a desert, and he loses control of his sons, etc. None of these people really die. Like he, his one of his most beloved wife dies, but um, none of these people really like die. Like he does reconcile with his brother. Joseph isn't dead. Like his family is saved. So he got everything he wanted, but he didn't get to enjoy it really all that much. And so, Jacob lived in many ways a good life, but not a happy one. And that's I think a harder pill to swallow. And interesting, I'm using a religious example, but I think that swallowing that pill is part of, and that you're not going to get happiness even in an afterlife, right? Swallowing that pill is, I think, something that philosophy encourages. That might be maybe subversive is too strong of a word, but it's not as hopeful as the religious spirit.
I really do appreciate your answer, and I mean it's not exactly a very well and thoroughly articulated question. I apologize for that.
No, no, it was very.
And as we're coming close to the concluding time, we will take one more questions from either the Q&A section or one of our panelists. And if not, we will conclude the project.
I was thinking about the new theology mentioned in our presentation and how Plato wants to reform the beliefs about the gods. I don't think we discussed yet the account of providence in this theology. Is there a strong affirmation of the gods' willingness to reward the virtuous and punish the unjust in this new theology that's in book two?
It's hard to think of these gods doing anything at all, right? I mean, uh, it's said they don't do evil, but punishment is not necessarily an evil. Punishment can actually produce good outcomes, right? This is Thrasymachus' misunderstanding because he thinks he's being innocent. He's just endorsing only punishment that leads to good. And certainly there is something like punishment in the afterlife in the myth of but that's outside of the context of this theological education. Hades is not said to be bad, according to this education, though it's strangely said that even if it is bad, it's suggested at one point that even if it is bad, you don't say that. Right. So it might actually be just frankly lying about what true religion is, which is a shocking thing if you really start to think about what he's saying there. But yeah, it's not a strong divine providence. The people who provide are really the guardian class and auxiliaries. And this is how the lower classes are to look at them. He says other cities have masters and slaves, but this city has supporters and saviors. So the artisans produce food and homes and clothing, all the stuff that the warriors need. And the warriors in turn save them and preserve them, right? So you have those who save and those who support. It's a kind of perfect homogeny. Not much said about that. Now, that being said, there is mention of during the lotteries of various prizes from the gods, etc. So it's complicated, but it's weird and difficult to think about this as being one way to square these two sort of contradictions that I've heard is something like this, that there's a kind of ideal or moral ideal, but when it comes to actual practice, there'll be slips, right? The way these contradictions are meant to show how in what ways and in what moments especially they will have to slip.
Slips on the part of who? On the part of
On the part of
the
the people.
other people.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the rulers, like you'll have to if you're going to tell some person who's undesirable that they have children, that you lost uh, the lottery again, the sexual lottery, you don't get to reproduce. That person better believe it comes from God if you want to keep it in order, right? So when
Yes.
you look at the moments where they depart from the theology later in the book, it's I think instructive of the places where you really need a God to do something, to sort of intervene, or you need to invoke a God as having determined a decision.
Yes, very, very good.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Priou. And I believe if
One,
that.
one more point though. In the
Oh,
noble lie, sorry, Kashu, it's said that they're born from the earth, right? And they have their whatever tools. So if you're a farmer, you're born with like a hoe or something like that, or a plow, and that's a kind of proficient. I guess they give them their tools upon birth and their jobs.
Yes, very all convenient.
right. And again, thank you so much, Professor Priou. And then I believe that's our last question, and that would conclude our program tonight. And
I just say your name is perfect for this. Is that your real name? It's like the
yeah,
second half. It's like wisdom and sun, right? It's
yeah,
like a republic name or something.
it is. And there's also a lot of other ways to write my last name because it's translated directly from my Chinese last name. But I honestly prefer this one because it's just so interesting, and I really do like it a lot, and I appreciate that.
Well, I
Um,
hope you live up to your name.
that's what I
I
hope for
sure
too.
can't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really what I hope for. And I try to do as much reading as I can, outside of what I already have to do for school, to live up to that. But yes. And again, thank you so much for joining us and guiding us through such a challenging and rich conversations and answering a lot of my weird and unarticulated questions.
They're,
Um,
they're great. And thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody who attended. I enjoyed this very much. It was good to talk to Kaishu again, as always.
Yeah. Thank you.
and I appreciate everyone who's attended and contributed to the discussion today. And with that, we formally close our session today. And please take care. Have a good day or good evening. And we hope to see you again at our next event.
Okay, thank you so much.
Cheers,
Great.
bye.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.